beings went hundreds of years without knowing anything about microbes. Ed Yong will be here to talk about I Contain Multitudes, about microbes and their relationship with the human body.
You know, when I eat a salad, I'm not just nourishing myself, I'm nourishing this entire world inside me that is part of me and is important for me.
We have a new columnist at the Book Review, and it's the brilliant essayist and critic Meghan Daum. This week, her first column on memoirs, Egos, debuts in the Book Review.
So the theme for this column is stories of not only coming out, but reparative therapy, ex-gay therapy, as it's called.
Also, Alexandra Alter will join us with news from the literary world. And Greg Cowles, John Williams, and I will talk about what we and other people are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Ed Yong joins us now. He is the author of I Contain Multitudes, The Microbes Within Us, and a Grander View of Life. Ed, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I have to say, you're sitting in front of me and you're like half my age and you have an amazing resume somehow at that age of 23 or whatever. You're on the staff at The Atlantic. You have your own blog, Not Exactly Rocket Science, hosted by National Geographic magazine. You have written for The New Yorker, Wired, for Us at the Times, Nature, New Scientist, The Guardian, The Times, Discover, and Slate. And don't you have an advanced degree in, what is it?
So I did natural sciences at university.
And is it a PhD that you have? Or?
No. I was the world's worst PhD student. So I started doing a PhD for a couple of years and flunked out. And for the sake of my health and the safety of my lab mates, I decided to move into writing about science instead of actually doing it.
Okay. Well, you not only do that, and then you also live part-time, as our listeners can hear, in London and in D.C. And on top of that, only half of your cells are human.
That's right, yeah.
So can you explain that?
Okay, so the average human body has around 37 trillion microbes, so bacteria and other microscopic organisms, and that's roughly one for each of our actual human cells. So really, even though I'm sitting here seemingly alone, I look like one individual in one body, I'm actually multitudes. I'm a colony, like a collective of many different organisms. And all of these other creatures, they're not just stowaways, they're not just hitchhikers. They are really crucial and important parts of my life. And they profoundly influence everything from my health to my immunity, my growth as I went from a single cell to an adult. And that's the same whether we're talking about me, you, every other animal around, every elephant and ant, every hawk and hummingbird is a collection of microbes and other small organisms that we cannot see.
So I feel like between this fact and the other crazy fact that people often cite about what percentage of our bodies are actually water, that we're almost like as much water in us as in a watermelon, I feel like what's left?
That's right, yeah.
But microbes seem to be kind of having a moment, like there are many, many books out right now about microbiology. Is that because of recent advances in the field?
Yeah, I think this area has really taken off in the last 10 years, and there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One is technological. So it used to be the case that you could only study microbes by growing them in the laboratory. And that's very hard because a lot of these things live in, they hate oxygen. They are very difficult to grow on a petri dish. But now genetic technologies have advanced to the point where you can just swab, like I can take a swab of my skin, this newspaper, this microphone, and I could split apart all the microbes in it and sequence their DNA. And through that, I can get a full inventory of everything that's there. And that really has allowed us to catalogue the extent of the microbiome. And then other techniques have allowed us to really look at what these microbes are actually doing. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the field is maturing. So this area of science sprouted up in lots of different disciplines in biology that were all very separate. So we had zoologists, botanists, medical people, immunologists, all studying different aspects of this world separate individually, and then they all started coming together. They formed links and connections between them. They all realized that they were looking at these microbial foundations that underlie all of biology. which I think is fitting with the themes of the book, right? It's all about unity and symbiosis and cooperation. And that's, when you see that among the scientists as well, that's why we understand those themes in nature.
Does microbiology's origins in all these various disciplines mean there isn't sort of one person, like we can't say, hey, Louis Pasteur, you discovered the microbe, or is there someone who was the first?
There is. His name is Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, and I've probably mangled the pronunciation.
I was admiring it, actually.
Thank you. Apologies to any Dutch listeners here. He was a Dutch person in the late 17th century, and he was not he was not a trained scientist, but he had amazing microscopes which he built himself, and they were so much better than anything else around in the day. And he trained them on everything that he could find in the world around him because he was deeply curious, and he saw these microscopic organisms moving, clearly alive, clearly animated, and clearly everywhere. They were in water, they were in the dental plaque on his teeth, and it just blows my mind, that moment in time when we went from not knowing that these things existed to knowing, when he became the first person in the history of the entire world to see microbes for the first time.
Did he record his thoughts at that moment?
Yeah, he did. He drew some very pretty diagrams. He wrote extensive letters to the Royal Society, the most eminent scientific organization at the time. His papers are fantastic because he's not a scholar, so it doesn't have that kind of stuffy tone that a lot of scientific papers has. It reads almost like a blog post. Like he goes into these ridiculous tangents about like the weather in the Netherlands at the time and like what his house is like. But he talks about microbes. He describes them in beautiful prose. He talks about them moving like spinning tops or fish darting through the water. And it's clear right from the start that he's so excited about this world. We bring so much cultural baggage to the world of microbes now. We think of them as things to avoid or to kill, but not Leeuwenhoek. He was excited. He was in awe of this world that he had seen.
So when did microbes get such a bad name? When did they become bacteria and
right.
badness? And
so a few centuries later, when people like Pasteur really confirmed the germ theory of disease, they showed that all of these illnesses which have been plaguing humanity for since time immemorial, like tuberculosis, plague, cholera, all of these were established as having a microbial cause. Like 1 year after the other, more and more microbes behind diseases were discovered, and that inevitably led them to be cast as villains. Everyone focused on the infectious side of microbiology, and that is by far the vast minority of microbes. Only a small proportion cause disease, and the vast majority are either benign, they're important parts of the environment, and they are important parts of us.
And yet we have this, fervent desire to be cleansed of these invaders as we see them with our antibacterial wipes and our I'm curious, do you use antibacterial wipes and soaps and things?
No, I don't. I'll wash my hands after I go to the toilet, sure. And I think like that sort of stuff is very important in some settings, like hospitals, obviously. But no, I don't. And it is shocking to see just how prevalent these products are. And when I was reporting for this book, I was staying in this hotel and I picked up the phone to make a call and it said antibacterial hand set on it. I don't even know how you make a hand set antibacterial, but there we go. And yeah, I think we have gone a bit too far with it, and we can see some of the consequences of that around us. There's a lot of evidence now suggesting that our limited exposure to microbes, particularly at an early age.
The hygiene hypothesis.
Right, that's right. Might be increasing our risk of allergies and inflammatory diseases because we can see that bacteria and other microbes help to calibrate our immune system. So they help to they stimulate the growth of certain types of immune cells, and they set the balance between reaction that will help to stop infections and overreaction that will cause us to go berserk at everything, harmless things in the world around us, dust, pollen, the like.
You also see a kind of obsession with microbes right now with diet and the way people are eating. Like at first there was that whole blood type diet thing, but now everything is about the gut and who else is in there and should you eat accordingly. What do you make of all that?
So I feel that we're only really at the start of understanding our microbiome at all, the players that are there, how they interact with us, and then what foods are going to nourish them. So there are some clear things, like, for example, dietary fiber nourishes a wide diversity of microbes. So I'm always keen to think about this in an ecological frame, by which I mean there's this large community inside us. So if we feed them with fiber, which consists of a large array of different plant carbohydrates, we're giving lots of varied food sources. And one microbe might be able to eat this bit, another might be able to eat this bit, so you can nourish this wide community, and that's why fiber is important. Then again, I could argue that fiber has been important for a long time, right? We've been told to eat fiber for as long as I can remember. So the microbial side of things, it enhances that old message. It gives a new twist on it. But I don't think it's so far telling us dietary messages that we didn't already know and were aware of. It's just emphasizing that when I eat a salad, I'm not just nourishing myself, I'm nourishing this entire world inside me that is part of me and is important for me.
It's like we're all pregnant all the time with many little teeny babies. What do recent advances in microbiology tell us about or change our understanding of evolution?
So the critical thing about the way microbes affect our evolution is that they make it really fast. So it's not that we're doing anything different. We're still changing according to the same old rules of Darwinian evolution. But rather than having to adapt to challenges by very gradually building up changes in our genomes, we can very quickly partner with microbes that already have those adaptations. So they've gone through the gradual changes and we're just picking them up. It's like if you have a skill deficit in your company, you can either train your employees and that will take time, or you can just recruit people who can do the job. And we see loads of examples of that in the animal kingdom. We have bugs in Japan that can become instantly resistant to insecticides if they swallow microbes in the soil that can detoxify those chemicals. There are rats that similarly can become instantly immune to poisons in plants if they have the right microbes in them, and suddenly they can eat this wide range of food in their environment. So for centuries, Japanese people have been harvesting seaweed from the ocean to make nori, that wrap that currently goes on around sushi. And they used to eat it raw, which meant that they would swallow marine microbes that lived on the seaweed and were already really good at breaking down the unique blend of carbohydrates on those foods. Mm-hmm. Those marine microbes went into the guts of those people, and they met their gut microbes. And when bacteria meet, they can do this incredible thing, which is just baffling to us. They can swap DNA. So, you and I can only send DNA down to children. We can only inherit vertically. But a bacterium can trade genes. So I could, if we were bacteria, I could reach out and give you some of my genes now. And that's what happened. So the marine microbes gave their seaweed-busting genes to gut microbes, which then passed down from one person to another, which is why, to this date, Japanese people have gut microbiomes that are better at digesting the carbohydrates in sushi, which I think is incredible. It just shows how quickly our microbes allow us to adapt to the things in the world around us.
I think our literary listeners will appreciate your title, which explain, I contain multitudes. So
it's obviously a quote from Walt Whitman, and I wanted a title that said, this is not just going to be like a stuffy science book. Hi, I've read a poem too. But I think it's one.
Scientists are human too.
I know, right? I wanted a title
half human.
Half human, that's right. My bacteria have read the poem too. I've read to them. I wanted a title that conveyed this grandeur, this expanded view of the world around us. Whitman said it best. I think it's a beautiful sentiment.
It's a quote from Leaves of Grass.
Yeah, the subtitle is also a literary reference in a slightly veiled way. So on The Origin of Species, Darwin ended with this wonderful thing about a tangled bank. And he talks about all these organisms living on a bank. And he talks about this, he says, there is grandeur in this view of life. So the grander view of life is a slight play on what Darwin wrote.
It would be so tempting to end on that note, but it would mean that we wouldn't get to talk about some of the very freaky things that are in here. You said that some of it does freak people out. Tell us about armpits.
Right. So I feel like to talk about armpits, I feel I first need to explain about hyenas. So hyenas are very social animals, and they produce this paste from their backsides that is full of microbes. So they have these glands that are full of microbes that make this paste that release scent into the atmosphere. And scent varies depending on the hyena's age, their sex, their sexual status. So the hyenas are basically writing an autobiography in bacterial odors using this stuff. And it turns out a lot of animals might do that. So, the smells that we release from our armpit odors are, bacterial scents. They are the byproducts of the microbes that live on us and the chemical reactions that they carry out. So maybe, we are releasing microbe-written autobiographies into the world around us. Maybe some of us could stand to do with doing that less. But it's not just that our microbes are affecting our own bodies. They are expanding out into the world around us.
And you have a different biome in each armpit.
Possibly, you're right. And certainly from the rest of your body. I mean, I talk about individuals as ecosystems, but really each individual is many ecosystems. My forearm is dry and exposed and barren, so it's more like a desert, whereas like my mouth is humid and hot, which is more like a rainforest. So we have all these different types of habitats on us, and I think that's wonderful to think about. If you look at like a picture of the Earth from space, you can see forests and oceans and deserts and snowy tundra. All of those different kinds of environments exist within us too.
All right. So Whitman, Darwin, and armpit bacteria all in this book, appropriately titled I Contain Multitudes, The Microbes Within Us and a Grander View of Life by Ed Yong. Ed, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with news from the literary world. And also she has a cold, so we will be very forgiving of her scratchy voice. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela. Thank you. I appreciate that. So there was a lot of turmoil this week at Barnes & Noble. The company has been struggling in recent years, going up against Amazon and really suffering from all the investments that they made in their Nook e-reader device. And they've cycled through 3 different chief executives in the last 3 years. The latest one to get the axe was Ron Bauer. He started last September, so his tenure was extremely short, and it sort of signals more turmoil at the company. Analysts were expecting him to really draw on his retail experience. He was at Toys R Us, he was at Sears Canada, and so he was really emphasizing Barnes & Noble's toys and games and things that were not book-related, and that seemed like a little bit...
They're not refrigerators.
...of a risky strategy for some. Some analysts thought that might kind of water down the brand a little bit. Actually, the revenues from non-book items were growing, so those investments did pay off, but he just didn't turn the company around quickly enough, and they are looking for someone new.
Now, who did he replace?
He replaced Michael Hoosby, who is now the executive chairman of Barnes & Noble Education. And before Michael Hoosby, it was William Lynch. And William Lynch was really the chief architect of their failed digital strategy. He invested everything in the Nook. That was going to be their way to get a foothold in the digital marketplace and really go head-to-head with Amazon on that front. And instead, they just lost a ton of money.
So who's in charge now?
So Leonard Riggio, who is the founder and the executive chairman of Barnes & Noble, was scheduled to retire as executive chairman this September. I spoke to him when that was announced this spring, and he was looking forward to reading a lot. He said possibly traveling and going back to all these leisure activities. So he's actually going to stay on in the interim until the board finds a new CEO, and he's going to be running the company.
Back to its origins.
Exactly.
It sounds like they are still struggling a bit to figure out what the proper strategy is to deal with the competition from the internet.
Exactly. And, their most recent earnings report in June, we really saw how much they're struggling. They reported a loss of $36 million, which was compared to a loss of $19 million the same period the previous year. And what's even more troubling is that other physical bookstores are doing better. This has actually become a surprisingly good environment for physical bookstores. Independent stores are growing. Their sales are up. And overall, bookstore sales rose 2.5% last year, which was the first time that bookstore sales had grown in, I think, 7 years, according to the Census Bureau. And you're seeing ebook sales dropping. Physical sales of print books are up. So it's sort of surprising that Barnes & Noble has not been able to kind of take advantage of all those shifts in the landscape.
This is hard to hear as a native New Yorker because Barnes & Noble has been a long-time New York institution. And yet, even in the city, they've had stores close in recent years. Are they expanding anywhere? Are they opening stores, or is it all about closures?
That's a great question. So they are still closing stores, but they're closing fewer stores than they have been recently. And they are opening 4 new concept stores, which people were really excited to hear. These are apparently going to have cafes that serve alcohol, which is great news for parents that show up at Barnes & Noble with their kids.
It's like the Alamo Drafthouse Cinema for books.
Exactly. So I think that's a clever way to get people to spend more time in the stores. They're going to have cafes.
Get them drunk.
Get them drunk. I mean, Starbucks was nice, but really, let's get some alcohol. They've actually drawn some lessons from, I think, the resurgence of independent stores. You're seeing individual Barnes & Noble outlets emphasizing the personal taste of their booksellers, catering to their communities in a little more specific way. They're absolutely drawing on the author community who, the authors and publishers have been very supportive of Barnes & Noble. They'll sign special copies for Barnes & Noble that they won't sign for other stores and things like that, just to essentially help the chain get back on its feet. It's funny because, there was a while where Barnes & Noble was really the bad guy, putting independents out of business. And now the fortunes have been reversed and Barnes & Noble is struggling. Independents are coming back and everyone's rooting for Barnes & Noble. It's kind of the underdog.
It's like the new shop around the corner.
Exactly.
All right. We will let Alexandra go back to her lozenges and her bed.
Thank you very much.
You know what? We are going to seduce them. We're going to seduce them with our square footage and our discounts and our deep armchairs and our cappuccino. That's right. They're going to hate us at the beginning, but we'll get them in the end.
Meghan Daum joins us now. She is our newest columnist, writing a column about memoir called Egos, and her first column is in this week's issue of the Book Review. Meghan, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
And I should mention that you are the author most recently of The Unspeakable and Other Subjects of Discussion, a book of essays, many of them personal, and you've written other books, including a memoir.
Yes.
Are you a reader of memoirs? Do you read a lot of them?
I tend to read them in the context of being a teacher often or a reviewer. I like memoirs a lot. It's not necessarily the first thing I go to. I mean, if I had all the free time in the world, I would just bring a stack of novels wherever I was going and read those. But memoir, it's a really interesting form, I think, particularly in this moment in cultural history when we're talking a lot about ourselves and talking a lot about people talking about themselves. So it's definitely, there's a lot of food for thought in reading them.
And you've written a memoir as well as personal essays. One of the interesting things is that there's this very fluid line between personal essays and memoir that I feel like has become more, kind of...
And I used to be much more militant about this. A couple of years ago, I would have said a personal essay is distinct from a memoir. A personal essay shall never darken the doorway of a memoir. But I agree. I think fluid is exactly the right word. I mean, memoirs, I think, tend to work best when the scale of ambition is relatively small. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. What I'm saying is when the author has set out to tell a particular story about a particular time and used his or her own life as a lens through which to look at bigger, more universal ideas. That's usually what works.
What memoirs do you think have done that really well?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, Darkness Visible is one of my favorite books, William Styron's memoir about depression. I mean, it's one of those books that The parameters are very narrow, but it goes very deep. It's like a deep dive.
Right. It's you can get to know someone very well by focusing on one thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I mean, recently I loved Bernard Cooper's My Avant-Garde Education, which came out last year, which talks about going to art school in the early 70s, I believe, and at Cal Arts in Southern California, and when that school was just starting. And he talks about himself, and he talks about, coming of age and coming out and his family. But really, it's a book about art itself and the avant-garde, and it asks the question, what is art? So that's something that I've read recently that is very graceful in how it takes on its immediate subject matter and then touches on much, much larger, more abstract ideas.
You've written a memoir also.
Life would be perfect if I lived in that house. Yes.
Okay. But in writing that memoir, did that change in any ways your approach as a reader of memoir? Did you appreciate the challenge more? Did you become more sort of critical in your assessment of other memoirs?
Oh, I'm probably more charitable.
Right, because it's so hard.
As we all are when we publish books. That was a book that is really about my interest/obsession with shelter and real estate and the idea of home, interior spaces, and more broadly, the larger cultural fixation on those things. The memoir I wrote was about this interest, but it used my sort of life trajectory up to a certain point as a framework for talking about that stuff.
So, okay, new column. It's called Egos. You get to write about memoirs every other month and choose whichever memoirs you're interested in to write about. Do you have a general idea of how you want to approach the column?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is approach it as an essay, first and foremost. I mean, I will be reviewing the books insofar as I'm going to be talking about whether or not I like them and what works about them and what perhaps does not. But yeah, I mean, what's really exciting about this is that I get to sort of look at what's out there and see if there are certain themes that come up, if there are things people are talking about, and take 3 or 4 or 5 books, whatever, and talk about how they all sort of approach a given theme in different ways.
So let's talk about your first column. You chose 3 books on a theme. What is that theme and what were you hoping to explore?
So the theme for this column is stories of not only coming out as a teenager, but in 2 of the cases, actually young men, boys who were gay and were put through reparative therapy, ex-gay therapy, as it's called. One of the books is Boy Erased by Gerard Conley, and I really hope I'm pronouncing his first name right.
I'll say Gerard, and one of us will be right. So Gerard Conley, what happens with him?
So this is a young man who's growing up in the Bible Belt in the South. His father is a Baptist preacher, extremely conservative, evangelical Christian community. And he goes to college and is outed and ends up being put almost immediately into this ex-gay therapy program. The remarkable thing about this is that this is actually taking place in 2004, not long ago. What I found really interesting about this book was the way it juxtaposed with another memoir that I talked about by Stephen Gaines, which is called One of These Things First. And this is about a young man who is growing up gay in Brooklyn in the 1950s and 60s, and is also put into ex-gay therapy, but in a very different context. He actually checks himself into the Payne Whitney Clinic in Manhattan.
Of his own volition.
Of his own volition. He has this really romantic idea about psychiatric institutions, which he's gotten from watching films like Splendor in the Grass. And
he watched the wrong movies.
It's just this Girl Interrupted was not out yet. And so it's this incredibly madcap, hilarious, also heartbreaking, but ultimately really, I've never read anything like this. He actually talks about going into this institution as if he sort of sat down at the Algonquin Round Table or something. He kind of finds himself and comes of age and comes into himself despite being in this reparative therapy. And so I think to look at these two books together was really interesting and really fun, frankly.
And the third book is called My Son Wears Heels, One Mom's Journey from Clueless to Kick-Ass by Julie Tarney. That sounds like very different from these other two books.
Yeah, very different, but also, again, this is a story of told from the mother's point of view of a boy growing up in the suburbs of Milwaukee. And in this case, they're not really sure what's going on. From a very young age, this child is identifying as... There's definitely a fluidity. He talks about feeling like a girl. He wants to dress in girls' clothes. He wants to play with girls' toys. And what's really interesting about this is the question isn't so much, is he gay, but what is he exactly? At one point as a child, he says, well, maybe I'm bisexual. And it, a lot of points it's like, well, maybe he just, is a cross-dresser. And at some points there's just talk of maybe this has more to do with wanting to dress a certain way than, having one particular sexual orientation. So what I loved about this book was the way that it was the mother told the story, but really almost anticipated the very basic questions that people would have in watching this from afar. And she does it in such a compassionate way. And she's almost like a case study in supportive parenting. It's like she tries so hard and is so well-intended and is so rigorous about educating herself and other people. And it's really, it was a lovely book to read in a lot of ways, particularly in the context of these other books where you're seeing really different parenting styles in different cultural contexts.
One of the fascinating things to me about books about gender identity and sexuality is how much they've changed just in the last 10 years. I mean, or in 15 years, I remember there was a period where at least a lot of people I knew were writing books about growing up with a gay parent. Or transgender parent. There was Noelle Howie edited an anthology of essayists writing about their parents having been gay or transgender when they were growing up. And then she wrote her own memoir, too. And there was this sense of shame and secrecy and fear around that. And then what's interesting is that the memoirs now of children of gay parents and the attitude now is... You people are from another era. What were you? That's crazy that you were hiding the fact that your parents were gay. And the approach has just changed so radically. And then similarly with this book, My Son Wears Heels, she's clearly not approaching it from the way a parent of a child who is questioning or sexual identity and sexuality would have 10 years ago as a complete crisis, but instead as something to just kind of figure out and be supportive.
That's very true. And that said, it's really important to note that My Son Wears Heels takes place largely in the 1990s. So it's notable that she doesn't have access to the internet. I think the book starts in 1992. What's fascinating about looking at these three books together is the way their timestamps are so important. I mean, we have a coming out story taking place in the 1960s. We have one that's taking place in the 1990s, and we have one that's taking place in the early aughts. And ironically, the one that takes place most recently involves sort of the most hideous treatment of this young man and seems the most retrograde in certain ways. So I think it really underscores the degree to which geography, culture, region, perhaps overrides time periods in a lot of ways.
Was there a standout among these three books? And the titles again are My Son Wears Heels by Julie Tarney, Boy Erased by Gerard Conley, and One of These Things First by Stephen Gaines.
Well, they're all very much worth reading. Otherwise, I would not have written about them. But I have to say, I love this Stephen Gaines memoir, One of These Things First. I think it is just such a treasure. It is so sharply written. It has such it is so funny. He has such control over his humor. He's really a comedian and a raconteur, but also just quite... I love it. I've really never read anything like it, and it was an absolute delight.
Wow. Okay. That's definitely a recommendation. Just looking ahead a bit, because you're already, I know, at work on your next column. Is it hard to figure out what to do? Because, I mean, in terms of themes, there's so many. We at the Book Review, we started this column in large part not only to have you write for us, but also because we get so many memoirs, and a lot of them are really interesting.
Yeah, they're a pretty direct reflection of what people are thinking about sort of more largely. I mean, I'm really interested because I teach nonfiction writing a lot. So I've had just so many students coming in and writing memoirs. And so I think it's almost like a psychological journey as well as a literary one when you're reading these things and thinking about which books you want to read and what's worth
I think of it as self-help, too, in many ways. Read about other people's problems.
Yeah, but also just why people like memoirs is that there is this feeling kind of like we're all in this together. This, the human condition is a thorny place to be. And I think maybe in the age of Facebook, when everyone is sort of, as you put it, curating themselves and kind of advertising themselves, to read a memoir where somebody's actually put that stuff aside and really told a story in an honest and vulnerable way is refreshing.
Well, now you know why we're so happy to have Meghan Daum as our newest columnist. Meghan, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
If you like hearing from authors and reviewers on the podcast, help us spread the word. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and rate the show or leave us a comment, preferably favorable. We'd love to hear what you think. Thank you, and let's get back to the show. My colleagues at the Book Review, Greg Cowles and John Williams, join us now to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, Greg, we're going to put much of the burden on you because you were coming back from what I feel like was a 9-week vacation, although it was probably only 2 weeks, and so had time to read.
I did, in fact, have time to read. I spent 2 weeks on the beach in Cape Cod. I was on Nantucket Island for a couple of weeks.
Aren't you feeling terrible for him?
It was really glorious. The weather was great. We were at the beach every day, and I brought a lot of books. When I read for pleasure instead of for work, I have kind
a lot more fun.
Well, there are kind of 3 different approaches I take to my serious reading. I also read for just smart thrillers and mysteries and things like that. But in my serious literary reading, the 3 strands that I do are going back and filling in holes, gaps in my reading. I know everyone has them, and there are a lot of classics that I missed. I wasn't an English major, and so I'm kind of always going back and plugging in kind of curriculum books that have passed me by. People may remember on the last podcast I was reading the William Maxwell novel So Long, See You Tomorrow, and I finished that on this Nantucket trip. It's a classic from the mid-20th century, a very short, spare, beautiful novel. It's really just incredible. Another strand of reading that I do is going back and rereading books that I've read in the past and really enjoyed. And this time around, I did that with Saul Bellows' Herzog, which became my beach reading for most of this trip.
That is not traditional beach reading. I mean, it's a great book.
Yeah, but parts of it are set on Martha's Vineyard.
Oh, right.
So, so it has that element to it. Not traditional beach reading, and my copy now is just waterlogged and bloated. It's already a fairly bloated book, very different from the William Maxwell, where that one is spare and precise and like haiku. The Herzog kind of contains everything. It's multitudes. It's a crazy book and just a great book, brings in the whole world. And I last read it probably about 20 years ago, and it's a very different book when you read it in what I will admit is middle age now, as opposed to a young man reading it.
Middle age has been delayed, by the way. We've put it into the 50s.
Oh, I'm not.
That's what I tell
Okay.
people that.
That's, yes,
I've
I've reallocated.
Now that John
It's
is
just
in his 40s, he tells people that.
Right. We're redefining middle age. But do go on.
So, I read that with great pleasure and almost for the first time because reading it as a middle-aged man, as a almost middle-aged man, is a different experience from reading it as a young man. And it maybe felt more profound or truer to my life experience now. The third strand of pleasure reading that I do is kind of catching up on contemporary writers whom I have not read for work or whom I have not kind of gone into the oeuvre for work.
I thought you were going to say coloring books. I was hoping that was the third strand.
No, but now you showed everyone that you were, in fact, a French major.
Or just pretentious.
That too.
It can be both.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago for work, I did read Jenny Offel's novel Department of Speculation, which I loved. And I had
one
not
of our best
read,
books of the year.
I had not read any other Jenny Offel to that point or since that point. And so while I was on Nantucket, I went into, they've got a couple of great independent bookstores there. And I went into one of them, Mitchell's bookstore, and found what I think might be Jenny Offel's first novel. It's called Last Things. It's a coming-of-age novel about, and I say coming-of-age, she's 8 years old. Her parents are splitting up, and it's the father is kind of a cold rationalist, and the mother is a big dreamer, very creative, imaginative type. It tackles some of the same themes as Department of Speculation, but from the point of view of an 8-year-old girl.
I have been reading a memoir by a Southern writer named Harry Crews called A Childhood. Crews died in 2012, and there was a biography published of him.
Is this another one of your obit reads? Where you read the obituary
No.
and then, okay.
No, but I did go back to the obituary because it was written by Marguerite Fox, who is just a master of the form, as I think most of our listeners probably know. And so when he died in 2012, she wrote the obit. I had heard about him a lot, but I was inspired to read it, delayed sort of. But I read Dwight Garner's review of a biography of him, I think earlier this year. Mm-hmm. And Dwight, in his usual way, just inspired me to pick up the books.
Harry Crews is very much a Dwight kind of a writer.
Yeah, he was
Who
very
is he?
convincing on him. He is a incredibly strange and very American character who grew up in rural Georgia. He was born during the Great Depression in small town Georgia to, very poor people who were tenant farmers and had, violent, very colorful lives. This book, which is a fairly slender memoir, I put in the category that I would call too good to fact check. I mean, some of these stories about his dad that he's telling that happened before he was even born are just incredible. It has a great first sentence, which is, my first memory is of a time 10 years before I was born, and the memory takes place where I have never been and involves my daddy, whom I never knew. And that's very much the tone of it. It's like tall tales, but real. And Marguerite Fox in her obituary said that he was famous for writing novels with incredibly weird characters. One guy eats a car 4 ounces at a time. There are snake handlers and, sideshow freaks and lots of drama. And Fox wrote that reading A Childhood makes you realize that for freakish drama, deep tragedy, and the blackest of black comedy, anything in Mr. Crews's fiction was resoundingly eclipsed by the facts of his own life. His dad died before he was 2, and then his mother remarried a few months later his dad's older brother, who was a violent alcoholic. The things that happen in here are just I think Fox also wrote they out Gothic Southern Gothic. But he's a great writer. He's a very vivid writer. He's a funny writer. There's a little bit of macho sentimentality in it that gets a little too much for me sometimes, but I would definitely recommend it.
Somebody who's a big fan of that book is Mary Carr, and she talks about it in The Art of Memoir as one of the books that just seized her early on at opening up the possibilities of memoir, and its voiciness was the thing. She talks a lot about voice in memoir, and this is the example she turns to over.
The voice is incredibly gripping from the beginning. Pamela, how about you? What are you reading these days?
Oh, no. Here comes my mea culpa because I'm really not reading a lot. I have a good excuse, which is that I'm now on season 5 of Veep, which I think is perfectly good. I'm rereading. I've been rereading the Harry Potter series now with my third child, trying to prepare him for an impending trip to London, which we expect to be Harry Potter heavy. We don't want him to be left out of that.
How old is he?
He's 7, so he's really a little bit young for Harry Potter.
Is he? Okay.
And I feel bad because I kind of hate the idea of like pushing kids into Harry Potter. I'm like, if you have to push your kids into Harry Potter, then I don't know what to say. But so our policy with our older kids was, read it when you're ready for it,
and when you want to,
and then then you can watch the movies.
Have you read the play?
I have not read the play because I'm seeing the play on Sunday, and I don't want any spoilers.
My
So
kids
do
gobbled
not-
it up on vacation.
All right, do not say a word. And,
So we'll get a theater review from you when you're back, as
that's
well as what you're
right.
reading.
I was rereading a little bit of Les Miserables, but I fear I've talked people's ears off about that novel enough, so I won't go into that. And then when it comes to my Hamilton, my real reading, I'm still in the Revolutionary War, so it's humiliating. I'm going to talk instead a little bit about what other people are reading on the bestseller list this week. The books that debut. Being a little bit Greg here. Greg's still partly on vacation. Jacqueline Woodson's first book for grown-ups in years. She's known primarily as a children's book author, but it's not her first adult novel. She debuts at number 16 with Another Brooklyn. Then we have B.A. Paris with Behind Closed Doors at number 15. Susan Wiggs with Family Tree at 13, about a tragedy in L.A. that sends a woman to a Vermont farm. Then debuting at number 5, Three Sisters, Three Queens from the very prolific Philippa Gregory. Not only writes a lot, but writes long. I don't know how she does it. And then another frequent contributor to the bestseller list, Catherine Coulter, debuts at number 2 with her new novel, Insidious, another FBI thriller. On the nonfiction list, I think the most interesting thing is that Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, the memoir by this white working class guy who grew up in the Rust Belt and went on to graduate from Yale Law School. That book is now number 1.
Wow.
So that kind of had a slow and then very fast build. That's probably the most notable thing on nonfiction. There are only 2 new books. Powerhouse by James Andrew Miller. That was reviewed by James B. Stewart in our pages recently. That's the history of CAA, the big Hollywood talent agency. And then the other new book is Adnan's Story by Rabia Chowdhury. And that is about Adnan Syed, who is the subject of Serial. That book debuts at number 14. And that is all. So thanks, Greg. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.